A wealthy man gave $350 to a struggling mother so she could buy food for her child. The next morning, he found her at the grave of someone he deeply loved, who had passed away 23 years ago. Richard Lawson sat at a table in one of the most luxurious restaurants in New York City. Yet, all the opulence surrounding him felt hollow. Nothing could fill the void inside him. Staring out the window, he watched the rain falling on the city streets. Droplets trickled down the glass like tears, echoing the heaviness in his heart. The outside world was dull and somber, perfectly mirroring his mood. Always gray, always bleak, always lonely. For over 2 decades, this had been his reality. Ever since Emily, his beloved wife, passed away in a tragic accident, Richard had been unable to move forward. Her death left a gaping hole in his life that neither wealth nor success could mend. He had built an empire, amassed unimaginable riches, but every victory felt empty. He went through the motions, attending meetings, hosting lavish dinners, but these distractions couldn't erase the sorrow he carried every single day. Richard absent-mindedly swirled the wine in his glass, watching it form endless circles. Business deals, extravagant meals, glamorous events. None of it meant anything to him anymore. It all felt flavorless and meaningless. With a deep sigh, he leaned back, weighed down by years of grief. Despite his success, the truth was clear. Richard was completely alone. He had no children, at least none that he knew of. Emily had never been keen to discuss having kids, and he hadn't pressed her on the topic. Now, he regretted it deeply. He longed for something, someone, to remind him of her, something to cherish and protect. He paid the bill and shrugged into his wool coat. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with chatter and laughter. But to Richard, it was nothing more than distant noise, like echoes from another world. Stepping outside, he felt the relentless rain soak through the air. The city pulsed with life, but Richard felt only the cold and the weight of his solitude. The walk home took him past places he and Emily used to visit together. Every street corner, every building was tied to a memory of a time when life felt simpler and happier. But now, those memories only left behind ghosts and a headstone. Tomorrow, like every other day, he would visit Emily's grave. While Paris would have been the natural resting place for her, she remained here instead, for reasons Richard never entirely understood. She had chosen New York as her resting place. Perhaps it was because the city symbolized the new life they had begun together, a life that was tragically cut short. As Richard walked along the rain-soaked sidewalk, something caught his eye. Beneath the awning of a closed shop, a young woman was huddled, clutching a baby tightly in her arms. Her hair was damp from the rain, making her look even more fragile. The sight stirred something deep within Richard. He stopped, unsure of what to do. Richard wasn't the type of person to get personally involved in such situations. Over the years, he had made generous donations to various charities, but dealing with someone in need face-to-face was entirely unfamiliar to him. Still, there was something about this young woman that compelled him to pause. Maybe it was the way she held her baby, with such tenderness and care, that reminded him of something, or someone. Slowly, Richard approached. Rain dripped from his coat as he pulled out $350 in cash he had just withdrawn. Handing it to her, he said, "Use this to get some food for you and your baby." The young woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. Gratitude quickly filled them, and she whispered, her voice trembling, "Thank you. Thank you so much." For a moment, Richard felt something shift inside him. It was a fleeting connection, as if their pain, though different, was somehow shared. Without another word, he nodded and walked away. But as he continued down the street, he couldn't shake the image of her and her baby. It was as though something buried deep within him had begun to awaken. When he finally reached home, Richard was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He lay down in bed, the sound of rain tapping against the window his only companion. He closed his eyes, but the image of the young woman and her baby replayed in his mind over and over again. Tomorrow, as always, he would visit Emily's grave. But what Richard didn't realize was that this routine visit was about to change his life forever. The next morning, Richard followed his usual routine. He woke early, dressed in his perfectly tailored suit, and prepared for his visit to Emily's grave. The gray skies outside his window mirrored his mood, and the streets were still damp from the previous night's rainstorm. Putting on his coat, he stepped outside, the familiar weight of grief settling over him as he made his way to the cemetery. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to the young woman and her baby. He couldn't understand why their faces lingered so vividly in his mind. Over the years, Richard had encountered countless people in need, but there was something different about this particular encounter. There had been a look in her eyes, a mix of desperation and something deeper, something he couldn't quite define. It unsettled him in a way he hadn't experienced before. When Richard arrived at the cemetery, he took the familiar path to Emily's grave. The air was quiet, broken only by the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the distant hum of the city. He knew this place too well. Every visit was the same. He would stand before her headstone, speak to her as if she were still there, and then leave, burdened by the same emptiness he'd felt for over 2 decades. But today was different. As he approached the grave, something unexpected awaited him. Richard noticed something unusual. Someone was there, kneeling in front of Emily's headstone. His heart skipped a beat. It was the young woman from the night before, the baby still cradled in her arms. She was hunched over, her shoulders shaking as though she were crying. Richard froze in his tracks, his mind racing. What was she doing here? How could she possibly know about Emily? The coincidence was too strange, unsettling even. A wave of confusion and unease washed over him as he cautiously approached her. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice low and uncertain. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her worn jacket. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, trying to regain her composure. "I didn't mean to intrude." Richard shook his head, still grappling with the scene before him. "You were there yesterday," he said slowly, piecing the events together. "Outside the restaurant. I gave you money." The woman nodded, glancing down at the baby in her arms, as if that alone explained everything. But for Richard, it didn't. He needed answers. Why was this stranger at his wife's grave? "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice firmer now. "How do you know Emily?" The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering with indecision. Then, after taking a deep breath, she met his gaze. Her voice was soft but steady when she finally spoke. "Emily, she was my mother." Richard's world tilted. He felt the ground shift beneath him, his breath caught in his throat. He stared at her in disbelief, struggling to process what she had just said. "Your mother?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "That's impossible. Emily never had a child." The woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "She did," she said quietly. "She had me. She just never told you." Richard staggered back, the weight of her revelation crashing down on him. His mind raced, scrambling for answers that made sense. Emily couldn't have had a child without telling him. Could she? The idea was inconceivable, but the conviction in the woman's voice made him question everything. "No," he muttered, almost to himself. "That can't be right. There's no way." "I know it's hard to believe," the woman said softly, her voice laced with empathy. "But it's the truth. My name is Sophie, and Emily was my mother." Richard felt his chest tighten as her words began to sink in. He looked at her, Sophie, and then at the baby in her arms. His mind filled with questions, but he didn't even know where to start. How could this have happened? How could Emily have kept something so monumental from him? "Why?" he finally asked, his voice cracking. "Why didn't she tell me?" Sophie looked down, sadness etched across her face. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never got the chance to meet her. She passed away before I could. I was raised by another family." Richard's heart pounded. He had spent over 2 decades mourning Emily, believing he knew everything about her. And now, out of nowhere, he was faced with the possibility that she had kept a secret so profound. It changed everything. A secret buried with her for all these years. He took a deep breath, his thoughts spiraling. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why now? Why are you here?" Sophie's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something familiar in them. Something that reminded him of Emily. "I only found out about her a few months ago," she explained. "I've been trying to piece together the truth ever since. When I found out where she was buried, I had to come." Richard stared at her, still trying to process everything. His emotions swirled, confusion, disbelief, even anger. But underneath it all was something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. His gaze shifted to the baby in Sophie's arms, and something inside him shifted too. If Sophie was telling the truth, if Emily really had been her mother, then this child was his grandchild. A piece of Emily that was still here, alive in the world. For the first time in decades, Richard felt something other than grief. He didn't know what to say or how to move forward, but one thing was clear. His life would never be the same again. His life had just changed in ways he could never have imagined. Richard stood frozen, staring at Sophie, his mind reeling from what she had revealed. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around the cemetery, but all he could hear was the pounding of his heart. The baby in Sophie's arms shifted, letting out a soft whimper, and that small sound seemed to break through his daze. How is this possible?" Richard's voice was barely audible, his mind racing with questions. He felt betrayed, not by Sophie, but by the memory of Emily. The woman he had mourned for over 2 decades now seemed like a stranger, someone with secrets he could never have imagined. But even in his confusion, he could see that Sophie believed every word she had said. "I know it's a lot to take in," Sophie said gently, though her tone remained steady. "I've spent my entire life trying to understand it too, but I promise you, I'm telling the truth. Emily was my mother." Richard's chest tightened, and he muttered under his breath, almost to himself, "Why didn't she tell me?" The thought of Emily hiding something so monumental from him was unbearable. For years, he had lain awake at night, haunted by what their life could have been if things had gone differently. Now, those thoughts carried an entirely new, painful weight. "I don't know why she didn't tell you," Sophie admitted, her voice filled with empathy. "I never had the chance to ask her. She died when I was just a baby." Richard's thoughts swirled, desperate to find clarity amidst the chaos. There had to be more to the story. "Who raised you then?" he asked, his voice uneven. "If Emily was your mother, why didn't I know about you?" Sophie glanced down at the ground, her discomfort evident. "After she passed, I was placed with another family," she explained. "I grew up not knowing anything about my real parents until recently. All I had was her name and bits of information I managed to piece together. I didn't even know where to start looking for you until a few months ago." Richard's heart ached. He had spent over 2 decades believing he knew everything there was to know about Emily, only to discover now that there were chapters of her life he had never been allowed to read. "So, you came here looking for answers," he said quietly. Sophie nodded. "Yes, I wanted to understand who she was. I wanted to know why she kept me a secret, and when I found out where she was buried, I knew I had to come." Richard's gaze fell to Emily's headstone, her name etched in cold, unfeeling stone. For years, visiting her grave had been his ritual, a way to cope with her absence, to find a semblance of peace. But now, standing here with Sophie and the baby, that peace felt shattered. Everything he thought he knew about Emily, his grief, and their life together, was being rewritten in real time. His eyes drifted to the baby in Sophie's arms. "And this baby," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he gestured toward the child. "Is this my grandchild?" Sophie looked down at the infant, her tense expression softening into a small, bittersweet smile. "Yes," she said quietly. "His name is Daniel." Richard stared at the baby, who seemed so small and fragile, his heart swelling with a mixture of emotions: shock, disbelief, and something else he hadn't felt in years: hope. Daniel was a connection to Emily, to a life Richard had never known existed but could now embrace. As the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm him, Richard's mind clung to the enormity of the moment. For years, he had been stuck in the past, mourning Emily and the life they had lost. Now, he realized that life hadn't disappeared entirely. It had continued on, silently, without him. And now, for the first time, he had the chance to reclaim a part of it. But even as hope began to flicker within him, a sense of betrayal lingered. How could Emily have kept something so profound from him? How could she have made such a life-altering decision without telling him? "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Why would she hide you from me? Why would she go through this alone?" Sophie's eyes were filled with sadness as she met his gaze. "I don't know the details," she said softly. "But I can imagine. Maybe she thought you wouldn't want the responsibility of a child. Or maybe she thought you were too focused on your work to be a father. I don't know, Richard. I wish I did." Richard shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "But she should have given me the choice," he said, his voice trembling. "She should have let me decide." "Maybe she was scared," Sophie said gently. "Maybe she didn't know how to tell you. Or maybe she thought she was protecting you." The idea that Emily might have kept Sophie a secret out of a sense of protection left Richard conflicted. He had always believed that Emily trusted him, that they were partners in everything. But now, he was beginning to realize there were parts of her he had never truly known. Richard's eyes met Sophie's again, and for the first time, he felt a strange sense of connection, not just to Sophie, but to the life he had never known existed. To the possibilities that had been lost, but that might now be reclaimed. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally, his voice soft but steady. Richard asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Sophie hesitated, then looked him in the eye. "I don't want anything from you. I just want to know where I came from. And I think you deserve to know the truth about your wife." Richard nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling deep within him. The truth about Emily, the truth he had lived so many years without. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain. His life had changed forever. There was no going back to how things were. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. He stood in stunned silence, struggling to fully comprehend the magnitude of what Sophie had just told him. Emily had a daughter, his daughter, a life he had never known, hidden from him for all these years. The betrayal stung deeply, but it was accompanied by confusion, regret, and something unexpected: responsibility. Sophie and the baby she held were living, breathing proof of a past he hadn't been allowed to be a part of. But they were here now, standing before him, and he couldn't ignore the implications. "I still don't understand," Richard said finally, his voice quieter now, the sharp edge of anger replaced by something softer. "Emily never told me she was pregnant. How could she have kept this from me?" Sophie's expression softened, her eyes flickering with empathy. "I don't know what her reasons were, Richard," she admitted. "I've asked myself the same question over and over, but I never got any answers. All I know is that she made that choice, for whatever reason, and it's affected both of us." Richard took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling. Emily had always been private, even with him. They had argued about it in the past, about how much she kept to herself. But this was a secret on a level he couldn't have imagined. "Do you know anything about her? About why she did it?" he asked, his voice tentative, almost as if he were afraid of the answer. Sophie sighed and looked down at the baby in her arms. "I wish I knew more. The people who raised me didn't know much about her either. I've spent the last few months trying to piece everything together, but there are still so many gaps. What I do know, though, is that she loved you." Richard's eyes widened at her words. "She told you that?" "No," Sophie said softly, shaking her head. "But I've seen it in everything I've learned about her. The way she talked about you to people. The way she lived her life. It's clear you were important to her, even if she kept you in the dark about some things." Richard clenched his jaw, a mix of frustration and sadness washing over him. For years, he had tried to make peace with Emily's death, to accept that the life they had planned together was gone. But now, this revelation reopened old wounds he thought had healed. He wasn't just mourning the loss of his wife anymore. He was mourning the life he had never known, the daughter he had never been given a chance to raise. "And you," Richard began, his voice strained. "Why now? Why did you decide to find me?" Sophie met his gaze, her expression calm but filled with purpose. "Because I needed answers too," she said simply. "For so long, I didn't even know who I was. I didn't know anything about her, or you. But when I started piecing things together, when I found out about you, I couldn't ignore it. I had to know, and I thought, maybe you needed to know too." Richard stared at her, trying to absorb the enormity of her words. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about Emily, had shifted. Yet as overwhelming as it was, one undeniable truth emerged. This moment wasn't just about pain or loss. It was also about a new beginning, one he wasn't sure he was ready for, but couldn't walk away from. Sophie met his gaze with a steady calmness that caught Richard off guard. "I didn't find out Emily was my mother until a few months ago," she began. "Before that, all I had was a name and a vague story about being adopted. When I learned the truth, I knew I had to come here to find out more about who I am and where I came from. To be honest, I wasn't sure what I'd find." Richard's breath caught in his throat as he saw the weight in Sophie's eyes, the burden of a past she couldn't access, a history that now felt like his responsibility to share. His gaze shifted to the baby in her arms, who was fast asleep. The gentle rise and fall of the child's chest felt surreal to Richard. This was his grandson, his blood, a continuation of the life he had shared with Emily, even if that life had been hidden from him for so long. "Daniel?" Sophie said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "His name is Daniel." Richard's eyes softened as he looked at the baby. "Daniel," he repeated, the name strange yet grounding. It rolled off his tongue with a weight that he hadn't expected. For so long, he had felt adrift, moving through life without any real purpose. But now, standing here with Sophie and Daniel, something inside him shifted. He wasn't sure what it was, but it felt significant. "I didn't come here to ask for anything," Sophie continued, pulling him from his thoughts. "I'm not expecting you to play a role in my life, or in Daniel's life. I just needed to know the truth. I needed to understand where I came from. And now I do." Richard stared at her, emotions tugging at his chest. He could see the resolve in her face, but he also saw how much courage it had taken for her to say those words. And yet, he knew he couldn't walk away from this. Not from her, not from Daniel. "You're my daughter," Richard said finally, the words feeling heavy and foreign on his tongue. He paused, glancing again at the baby. "And that makes Daniel my grandson." Sophie looked at him cautiously, unsure of what he was getting at. "I've spent my whole life building something," Richard continued, his voice soft but determined. "A business, an empire, but none of it ever really mattered. Not after Emily died. I thought I'd lost everything that gave my life meaning. But now I'm realizing that maybe I still have a chance to fix that, to be something more than just a businessman." Sophie blinked, her face a mixture of surprise and guarded skepticism. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying that if you'll let me, I want to be part of your life," Richard said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "I've already missed so much, but I don't want to miss anything more." Sophie stared at him, her expression unreadable. Richard could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear of opening herself up to someone she had never known. But beneath that, there was something else, a flicker of hope. A small but undeniable hope that maybe this moment could be the start of something new. "I don't know if it'll be easy," Sophie said finally, her voice soft. "There's a lot we don't know about each other." Her words hung in the air, but they weren't dismissive. Instead, they felt like a tentative opening, a small step toward possibility. Richard nodded. "I know," he said softly. "But I'm willing to try, if you are." Sophie looked down at Daniel, then back at Richard. There was hesitation in her eyes, but also a flicker of trust. "Okay," she said quietly, "we can try." For the first time in years, Richard felt a faint spark of warmth in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to give him hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still something left for him to hold on to. As Richard walked away from the cemetery that day, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The revelation that Emily had kept such a monumental secret gnawed at him, and the thought of Sophie and Daniel lingered heavily in his mind. His life, once so controlled and predictable, felt like it had been flipped upside down in just a few hours. The city bustled around him with its usual energy, but Richard moved through it as though on autopilot. The encounter with Sophie had shaken him to his core, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about his past. As much as he wanted to feel anger or betrayal toward Emily, he couldn't ignore the strange sense of responsibility growing inside him. Sophie was his daughter. Daniel was his grandson. He couldn't walk away from that. When Richard returned to his apartment, the rain had started again, tapping gently against the windows. He stood in the dimly lit room, staring out at the city, his thoughts drifting back to Emily. He could almost hear her laugh, picture the way she used to look at him, and feel the dreams they had once shared before everything had fallen apart. For years, he had tried to preserve her memory, to keep her alive in some small way through his grief. But now, with Sophie's revelation, he couldn't help but wonder. Had he ever really known Emily at all? Why had she kept this from him? What had been going through her mind in those final months of her life? The questions buzzed in his head, relentless, demanding answers he wasn't sure he would ever find. Richard walked to his desk, where he kept a small collection of keepsakes from his time with Emily. Old photos, letters, little trinkets that once held meaning for them both. He picked up a photo of the two of them from their early days together, back when everything had seemed so full of promise. They looked so happy, so in love. He couldn't reconcile the woman in the photo with the one who had kept such a life-altering secret from him. Sitting down, Richard opened a drawer and pulled out a worn notebook. It was Emily's journal, something she had kept sporadically throughout their marriage. He had found it after she died, but had never had the courage to read it, fearing it would only deepen his grief. But now, it felt like his only hope of understanding what had happened. With a deep breath, Richard opened the journal. The handwriting was familiar, the elegant script he had seen in countless notes and letters over the years. He flipped through the pages, reading her thoughts on mundane things. Dinners they had shared, vacations they had taken. At first, nothing stood out. But then, buried toward the back of the journal, he found it. The entry was dated just a few months before Emily's death. As Richard's eyes scanned the page, his heart began to race. "I don't know what to do. I'm terrified. How could I let this happen now, after all these years?" Richard would never understand. He's so focused on the business, on our future. I can't be the one to take that away from him. He deserves more than I can give. I just wish I could tell him, but I know it would destroy him. I can't let him see me like this. I can't let him know. Richard's chest tightened as he read the words. Emily had been scared of how he would react, scared of how her pregnancy might change their lives. But why hadn't she trusted him? Why had she thought he wouldn't want to be part of it? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Emily hadn't kept Sophie a secret out of malice or deception. She had done it because she thought it was for his own good. In her own way, she had been trying to protect him. From what, exactly, he wasn't sure. From the burden of raising a child when their lives were already complicated? From the fear of disappointing him? Whatever her reasons, it had been fear, not betrayal, that had driven her decision. Richard slumped back in his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Emily's choice, made out of love or fear or both, had irrevocable consequences. Sophie had grown up not knowing her father, and Richard had been robbed of the chance to be part of her life, and Daniel's. He closed the journal, his mind spinning. There was no way to change what had happened, no way to go back and fix the choices Emily had made, but there was still a path forward. Sophie had come to him seeking answers, and now, more than ever, Richard knew he couldn't turn his back on her. He stood up, his resolve hardening. If there was one thing he could still do, it was be there for Sophie and Daniel. He had already lost so much time, and he wasn't about to lose any more. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He needed to reach out to Sophie. He had promised her he would try, and now, more than ever, he was determined to keep that promise. He wasn't sure how it would work, or how they would navigate the tangled emotions between them. But one thing was certain, he was willing to try. He picked up the phone and dialed the number Sophie had given him. His heart raced as he listened to the rings, unsure of what he would say once she answered. Each passing second felt heavier, until finally her voice came through the line, soft, yet steady. "Hello? Sophie," Richard began, his voice betraying the nervousness he felt. "It's me, Richard. I've been thinking about everything, and I think we need to talk." There was a pause on the other end, long enough to make Richard hold his breath. He feared what her response might be, but finally, Sophie spoke. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think we do." Richard exhaled, the tension in his chest easing just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for now, a start was enough. The next time Richard saw Sophie, it was in a quiet corner of a small cafe, tucked away from the bustling streets of the city. He had chosen the location carefully. Intimate, but neutral. A place where they could talk without the weight of the past bearing down too heavily. Richard arrived early, fidgeting nervously as he adjusted his shirt collar. He glanced down at the table, then out the window, trying to still the racing thoughts in his head. Everything he had read in Emily's journal swirled in his mind, bringing him closer to understanding her while deepening the ache of questions that could never be answered. The sound of the door opening drew his attention, and he looked up to see Sophie entering the cafe with Daniel in her arms. She spotted him immediately, her expression calm but cautious as she walked over. There was a slight tension in her movements, like she wasn't sure how this meeting would go. "Hi," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. She adjusted Daniel in her arms, making him comfortable before glancing back at Richard. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course," Richard said, his voice rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat and glanced down at Daniel, who stared up at him with wide, curious eyes. The baby was quiet, but his gaze was so intent it unsettled Richard. In a way, he couldn't quite explain. "How is he?" Sophie smiled faintly, brushing a hand over Daniel's small head. "He's doing good, growing fast." A brief silence hung between them, neither one sure how to begin the conversation that was waiting to unfold. Richard finally cleared his throat again, deciding it was best to dive right in. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me," he began, his voice low. "And I found something that explains a little about why Emily didn't tell me about you." Sophie raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of curiosity and guardedness. "What did you find?" Richard hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of his jacket pocket. Then, with a deep breath, he reached in and pulled out Emily's journal. He slid it across the table toward Sophie, watching as her gaze shifted to the worn notebook. "It's her journal," he said quietly. "I found it after she passed, but I never had the courage to read it, until now." Sophie's hand hovered over the journal, her eyes scanning its weathered cover. She didn't pick it up right away, but looked back at Richard, waiting for him to continue. "There's an entry," Richard explained, his voice faltering slightly. "It was written just a few months before before she died. It explains a lot about why she kept you a secret." Sophie's expression softened, though her hesitation remained. "What does it say?" Richard swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "She was scared, Sophie. She didn't know how to tell me. She thought she was protecting me, protecting us, but she also felt like she couldn't handle the weight of it all." Sophie looked down at the journal again, her fingers tracing its edges. She didn't speak, but Richard could see the flicker of emotion in her eyes. After a moment, she finally opened it, flipping to the entry he had mentioned. As her eyes scanned the words, her breath hitched slightly, and she paused to steady herself. "She really thought she was doing the right thing," Sophie said softly, more to herself than to Richard. "I think she did," Richard replied gently, "but that doesn't make it easier for either of us." Sophie nodded, her eyes still on the journal. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of Emily's choices and the consequences they had wrought sat heavy between them. But as Sophie closed the journal and looked back at Richard, there was something new in her expression, a glimmer of understanding, maybe even a spark of hope. "Thank you," Sophie said quietly, "for sharing this with me." Richard nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "I want us to move forward, Sophie," he said. "I know we can't change the past, but we can try to build something from here. For you, for Daniel, for all of us." Sophie hesitated for a moment, then gave him a small, tentative smile. "Okay," she said. "Let's try." For the first time, Richard felt the faintest sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin again. "Sophie, I found this," Richard said, sliding the journal across the table. "It's her journal from the last year of her life. She wrote about her fears, her worries, why she kept you a secret." Sophie stared at the journal, her fingers grazing the edges of the cover, but stopping short of opening it. "She wrote about me?" she asked softly. Richard nodded. "She didn't name you directly, but it's clear she was scared. Scared of how I'd react? Scared of how having a child would change everything for us. She thought she was protecting me by keeping it from me." Sophie's expression softened as her hand lingered on the journal, then pulled away. "I've spent my whole life wondering why she didn't want me," she admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. "It's hard to hear that it wasn't just about me, that she was trying to protect you too." Richard leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "It wasn't that she didn't want you, Sophie. I can see now that she was overwhelmed. She didn't know how to handle everything. But that doesn't mean she didn't love you. I think she was just lost." Sophie let out a long, shaky breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I guess I always thought if I could find out why she gave me up, it would give me some closure," she said. "But now, it just feels complicated." Richard nodded slowly. "I know it's not easy, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't change the past. You can only decide what to do with the present." There was a pause as Sophie's emotions flickered across her face. Sadness, confusion, but also a hint of relief. It was as though hearing these words about her mother had lifted a piece of the weight she had carried for so long. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Sophie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so much time feeling angry, at her, at you, and now I don't even know what to feel." Richard's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He wanted to say something, anything, to make it better. But he knew there were no simple answers. They were both navigating uncharted territory, trying to make sense of the mess Emily had left behind. "I get it," Richard said gently. "I've been angry too, but maybe we can figure this out together." Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "You really want to be a part of my life? After everything?" "I do," Richard said without hesitation. "I've already lost so much time, Sophie. I don't want to lose anymore. If you're willing to give this a chance, I am too." Sophie was quiet for a moment, her gaze dropping to the table before she nodded slowly. "I'm willing to try, but I need time, Richard. This is a lot to take in." Richard reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers, but not quite touching. "I understand," he said softly. "We'll take it one step at a time. There's no rush." Sophie glanced down at Daniel, who had fallen asleep in her arms, then back at Richard. A small, bittersweet smile touched her lips. "He doesn't have a grandfather, you know," she said softly. Richard's heart swelled at her words. "I'd like to change that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. "I think Daniel would like that too." For the first time in what felt like forever, Richard felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. After so many years of believing his life had ended when Emily died, that there was no way forward, he finally felt as though the path wasn't completely closed. Sitting here with Sophie and Daniel, he realized there was still something worth rebuilding, something worth trying for. He realized there was still something left to fight for. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared past lingering in the air. But beneath that heaviness, something new had begun to take root, a tentative connection, fragile yet promising. It was a chance to rebuild what had been lost. As they left the cafe, Richard walked beside Sophie, feeling the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time that day. It was a small, almost imperceptible change, but it felt like a sign. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could hold something more. In the days that followed their meeting at the cafe, there was a cautious optimism between them. Richard and Sophie began seeing more of each other, though always with a certain hesitance, as if they were both afraid of saying or doing something that might break the fragile bond they were beginning to form. Richard, for his part, was determined to show Sophie that he was serious about being part of her life, but he also understood her need for space. It wasn't easy. Every time he looked at Sophie, he was reminded of how much he had missed, how many years had slipped through his fingers. As much as he wanted to embrace this new chapter, the past still weighed heavily on his mind. His thoughts often drifted back to Emily and the choices she had made. He had spent so many years idealizing her, putting her on a pedestal, that reconciling the woman he loved with the one who had kept such a life-altering secret was a struggle he couldn't quite overcome. One evening, after a particularly long day, Richard sat in his living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. He hadn't seen Sophie for a few days. While he wanted to reach out, he was trying to respect her boundaries. A delicate balance he wasn't sure how to navigate. Pushing too hard might drive her away, but holding back felt like he was letting the opportunity slip through his fingers once again. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Sophie. "Can we talk tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you." Richard's heart skipped a beat. The message was simple, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. He quickly typed out a reply, agreeing to meet her, then sat back, his mind racing with possibilities. What could she need to tell him? Was it about Daniel? Or perhaps something about Emily? Some new piece of the puzzle that might help him make sense of it all? The next morning, they met at a park not far from Sophie's apartment. Daniel was with her, bundled up in his stroller. As Richard approached, he noticed the tension in Sophie's posture. She smiled when she saw him, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey," she said softly, her voice strained. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course," Richard replied, his concern growing. "What's going on?" Sophie gestured to a nearby bench, and they sat down facing a small lake. The water was calm, reflecting the clear blue sky above, but the atmosphere between them was far from peaceful. Richard could sense that whatever Sophie had to say was weighing heavily on her. "I've been thinking a lot," Sophie began, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. "About everything. About you, about my mom, about Daniel. And there's something I haven't told you yet." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He worked to keep his expression calm, but he could feel the tension building inside him. "You can tell me anything, Sophie," he said gently. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Sophie nodded, but kept her gaze fixed on the lake, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always wondered why my mom didn't tell you about me. I thought maybe it was because she didn't want to burden you, or because she was scared of how you'd react. But I found something recently, something that might explain it." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "What did you find?" Sophie hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to Richard, her eyes finally meeting his. He could see the mixture of fear and sadness in them. Richard unfolded the paper carefully, his hands trembling slightly. It was a letter, old and worn, with frayed edges and ink that had started to fade. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Emily's. His heart began to pound as he started reading, the words coming into focus. "Richard, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it anyway. I've been keeping something from you, something I'm not sure I'll ever have the courage to tell you in person. I'm pregnant, and I'm terrified. I know you've always said you didn't want children, and I've respected that. But now, with this news, I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to burden you with something you never wanted. So I'm making the choice to keep this from you. Not because I don't love you, but because I do. I hope one day you'll forgive me for this." Richard's hands shook as he finished reading. He stared at the letter, his mind racing to process the words. Emily had been pregnant. She had known, and she had made the decision to keep it from him because she thought it was what he wanted, because of something he had said years ago, likely in passing, long before they were even married. I don't understand," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never told her I didn't want children. I mean, maybe I said it once, when we were young, but I never meant it like that. I thought we would figure it out together." Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I think she was just scared, Richard. She didn't want to lose you, and she thought this was the only way to keep you." Richard shook his head, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. He had spent years believing that he and Emily had been perfectly aligned, that they had understood each other completely. Now he realized they had been living with unspoken fears and assumptions that had driven them apart in ways he never could have imagined. "I didn't know," Richard said, his voice breaking. "If I had known, I would have been there for her. I would have been there for you." Sophie placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but grounding. "I know," she said softly. And maybe, deep down, she did too. But she made the choice she thought was right at the time. And now, we're here. Richard's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The pain of what had been lost, what could have been, was overwhelming. But Sophie was right. They couldn't change the past. All they could do was decide what to do with the future. He looked at Sophie, the daughter he had never known, and then at Daniel, the grandson who had so unexpectedly become part of his life. "I don't want to waste any more time," Richard said finally, his voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "I want to be part of your life." "Sophie, I want to be there for Daniel," Richard said, his voice steady with determination. "I don't care how complicated it is. We'll figure it out." Sophie smiled through her own tears, nodding slowly. "I want that too." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the past still hanging heavily between them. But now, there was something else, a sense of hope for the future, finally starting to break through. It wasn't going to be easy. There were still so many unanswered questions, so much pain to process, but for the first time, Richard felt like they were both ready to take the next step, together. The days after their conversation in the park passed slowly for Richard. His mind kept circling back to the letter Sophie had shown him. Emily's words haunted him. She had made a decision based on a fear he hadn't even realized she carried, a fear that had changed the course of both their lives forever. Richard had always prided himself on being in control of his choices, his emotions, his life. But now, Faced with the reality of unspoken desires and misunderstood fears, he felt himself unraveling under the enormity of it all. One late evening, Richard sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Emily's journal and the letter Sophie had given him lay open on the desk before him. The faint hum of the city outside provided a quiet backdrop to the stillness of the room. He felt trapped, caught between the life he thought he'd known and the truth that had surfaced. He thought back to the life he and Emily had shared. He remembered imagining, in fleeting moments, a future where they might have children, a life filled with the laughter and chaos of raising a family. But life had always seemed too busy. His career, their travels, the endless possibilities, they had always planned to talk about it later. But later never came. The real blow was knowing that his own words, spoken casually so many years ago, had driven Emily to make such a life-altering decision alone. He didn't even remember the exact conversation. They had been young, early in their relationship, and he had likely said something about not wanting children at the time. Maybe even that he wasn't sure he ever would. But he hadn't meant it as a final decision. He had assumed they would revisit the topic when the time was right. That time never came. Emily had made her choice, and now Richard was left to grapple with the consequences. Taking a deep breath, Richard stared at the papers in front of him. His feelings toward Emily had grown more complicated. The grief he had carried for so long was now tangled with love, anger, and regret. He still loved her, he always would, but that love was now shadowed by the realization of what could have been. The life they might have shared, the family they might have built. Then there was Sophie, the daughter he had never known, the child Emily had hidden from him in an attempt to protect him from a burden he would have gladly embraced. He wanted to be there for her now, to make up for all the lost time. But how? How could he bridge the gap between them? They were strangers, bound by blood but divided by years of silence and secrets. Richard knew he couldn't force a relationship. Sophie had her own life, her own pain, and her own experiences. He couldn't step in and expect to magically fix everything. Trust had to be earned, and his place in her life wasn't guaranteed. It was something he would have to work for. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Sophie. "Are you free tomorrow? Daniel has a doctor's appointment in the afternoon, and I was wondering if you wanted to come with us. No pressure, just thought you might want to be there." Richard stared at the screen, his heart swelling with a mix of anxiety and hope. Sophie was reaching out. She was giving him a chance to be part of her and Daniel's lives, to take the first steps toward something new. He quickly typed back a response. "I'd love to come, just let me know the time." As soon as he hit send, a sense of relief washed over him. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. He wasn't sure what to expect or how it would feel to step into this new role, but he knew one thing. He was willing to try. For Sophie, for Daniel, for the family he had lost and the one he still had a chance to be part of. The next day, Richard met Sophie outside the pediatrician's office. She was standing by the entrance, Daniel bundled up in his stroller, looking both relieved and nervous to see him. Richard couldn't help but smile as he approached. Daniel's big eyes blinked up at him from under his tiny hat, and for a moment, all of Richard's doubts seemed to melt away. "Hey," Sophie said, her voice soft but welcoming. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," Richard replied, crouching down to get a closer look at Daniel. "How's this little guy doing?" "He's good," Sophie answered with a faint smile, adjusting Daniel's blanket. "A bit fussy, but nothing unusual." Richard's heart warmed at her words. He could sense how much it meant for Sophie to invite him here, to let him into this part of her life. He knew it wasn't easy for her. Her walls were still there, built carefully over years of hurt. But she was trying, and that was more than he could have hoped for. "I thought it might be nice for you to be here," Sophie added, her voice quiet. "You know, to get to know him a little." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you," he said sincerely. They walked into the pediatrician's office together, making small talk while waiting for Daniel's appointment. Richard found himself watching Sophie closely. The way she spoke to her son, the gentle tone of her voice, the way she seemed to instinctively know his every need. It was heartwarming to witness, but also bittersweet. He couldn't help but wonder what it would have been like if he'd been there from the beginning, if he had been part of her life as she grew up. But he quickly pushed those thoughts aside. There was no use in dwelling on the past. He was here now, and that's what mattered. The doctor's visit was routine, just a quick checkup, but to Richard, it felt monumental. As he sat beside Sophie, watching the doctor weigh and measure Daniel, he realized that these were the moments he had missed. The simple, everyday moments of being a parent or grandparent, watching a child grow and change. It wasn't glamorous or extraordinary, but it was real. And in those small moments, he found a connection he hadn't realized he'd been longing for. When the appointment was over, they stepped back outside into the crisp afternoon air. Richard turned to Sophie, feeling his emotions welling up. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere, "for letting me be part of this." Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're welcome," she replied. "I want you to be part of it. I know it's not going to be easy, but I think we can figure it out." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of her words. They were on the same page, both cautious, both uncertain, but both willing to try. As they stood there, the sunset casting warm hues over the city skyline, Richard allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. Maybe, just maybe, there was still time to heal, to make amends, to be the father and grandfather he wanted to be. As the days turned into weeks, Richard began to feel a cautious sense of hope growing within him. He started spending more time with Sophie and Daniel, slowly finding a rhythm in their interactions. The initial awkwardness that had marked their early meetings was beginning to fade, replaced by something fragile but genuine, a connection that felt like it could grow into something meaningful. Richard was careful not to push too hard. He let Sophie set the pace, always mindful of the boundaries she still held. But he also made it clear that he was fully committed to being part of their lives. One afternoon, Sophie invited him to her apartment for the first time. It was modest, small, but cozy. As Richard stepped inside, he immediately noticed the care Sophie had put into making it a home for herself and Daniel. Toys were scattered on the living room floor. A soft blanket was draped over the couch, and the faint scent of baby lotion and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. "Make yourself comfortable," Sophie said, motioning to the couch as she unbuckled Daniel from his stroller. "I'll get us some coffee." Richard nodded and sat down, taking in the space around him. He felt a strange mix of pride and regret. Pride in the life Sophie had built for herself, but a deep sadness that he hadn't been there to witness any of it. He had missed so much. And no matter how much effort he put into moving forward, that sense of loss would always linger. While Sophie disappeared into the kitchen, Richard's gaze drifted to a small photo frame on a nearby shelf. It was a picture of Sophie holding Daniel. They were both smiling, their eyes bright with joy. The simplicity of the image hit Richard hard. It was the kind of moment he had always imagined sharing with his family, but one he'd never had. As he stared at the photo, he realized something profound. He was looking at the family he never knew he had, and despite all the pain and loss, he still had a chance to be part of their story. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. And for the first time, that felt like enough. He was only now beginning to understand. Sophie returned a few moments later, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Richard before settling back into her seat, adjusting Daniel on her lap. The baby cooed softly, his chubby hands reaching for his mother's hair. "So," Sophie began, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking a lot lately, about everything, about us, about Mom, and there's something else I think you should know." Richard looked up from his coffee, his heart rate quickening slightly. He had grown accustomed to the idea that there might always be new revelations when it came to Emily and Sophie's past, but that didn't make them any easier to hear. "What is it?" he asked carefully. Sophie took a deep breath, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with Daniel's tiny hand. "After we talked about Mom and why she kept me a secret from you, I started digging a little deeper. I wanted to understand more about her life, why she made the choices she did. And I found something that, well, it changes things." Richard frowned, setting his mug down on the coffee table. "What do you mean?" Sophie hesitated before standing up and walking over to the bookshelf. She pulled out a small box Richard hadn't noticed before and brought it back to the couch, placing it between them. "This," Sophie said quietly, opening the box, "was in Mom's things. It's a letter, but it's not from her. It's from someone else, someone I think you knew." Richard's stomach tightened as Sophie handed him the letter. Slowly, he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was addressed to Emily, but the signature at the bottom made his heart stop. It was from someone named James. Not just any James, James Porter. Richard's mind reeled. James had been a close friend during his younger days, long before he met Emily. They had lost touch over the years, but he had never questioned their friendship. As he began to read, his blood ran cold. "Emily, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to send this to you, but I need to write it down, even if only for my own peace of mind. I know we've kept this secret for so long, but it's weighing on me more than ever. Richard has no idea about what happened between us, and I can't bear to keep pretending. I'm not asking you to tell him. I know how complicated things are. But I need you to know that I've never stopped thinking about you, about what we had. If things were different, I would have fought harder for you. But I know you made your choice. I just hope you're happy, even if it's not with me. With love, James." Richard's hands trembled as he finished reading. He stared at the letter, his mind spinning. James and Emily? Had there been something between them? Something he had never known? Sophie watched him carefully, her expression full of empathy. "I didn't want to tell you right away," she said softly. "I wasn't sure how you'd take it, but I thought you deserved to know." Richard struggled to find his voice. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the revelation settled over him like a tidal wave. James had been his friend, someone he had trusted, and Emily, the woman he had loved so deeply. This letter suggested something entirely different, something he hadn't even considered. "Are you saying," Richard began, his voice shaking, "are you saying that James and Emily—" Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I don't know all the details," she admitted. "I don't know when it happened or how long it lasted. But yeah, it seems like they were involved at some point." Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. He stood, pacing the small living room as his thoughts raced. He had always believed that what he and Emily shared was special, unbreakable. But now this letter, it called everything into question. Had Emily loved James? Had she kept this secret from him out of fear of losing him? Or had there been something more, something he had been blind to all along? "I can't believe this," Richard muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what to think." Sophie stood up and walked over to Richard, placing a hand gently on his arm. "I know this is hard, Richard. Believe me, I've been struggling with it too, but I don't think Mom ever wanted to hurt you," she said softly. "I think she was just scared, like she was with so many other things." Richard swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness boil inside him. He had spent years mourning Emily, grieving the life they had lost, and now it seemed like that life had been built on secrets he had never known. "What do we do with this?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. "How do we move forward from here?" Sophie sighed, her eyes mirroring the same uncertainty Richard felt. "I don't know," she admitted. "I wish I had the answers, but I think it's just going to take time. Time to process everything." Time to figure out what it all means. Richard nodded slowly, his mind still spinning. He didn't know how to move forward, how to reconcile the love he had for Emily with the truth of her relationship with James. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to lose Sophie. Not now, not after everything they had been through. "I don't want to lose you," Richard said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. "Whatever happens, whatever we find out, I don't want this to come between us." Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're not going to lose me, Richard. We're in this together." Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was enough for now. It was enough. The revelation about James Porter consumed Richard over the next few days. No matter how much he thought about it, the answers he sought remained elusive. His mind replayed old memories, moments from his past with Emily and James, as he searched for any hint of this secret. But there was nothing. No moment stood out. No suspicion had ever crossed his mind. How could he have missed it? Richard found himself pacing his apartment late into the night, unable to sleep. The letter Sophie had found haunted him. It raised so many questions. Had Emily loved James? Had it been a fleeting affair or something more serious? And why had James never told him the truth? More than anything, Richard felt betrayed. He had trusted them both, Emily as his wife and James as a close friend. But now that trust felt shattered, replaced by a gnawing doubt that refused to go away. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He needed answers. He couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. After some searching, he found James's contact information. They hadn't spoken in years, not since they had drifted apart after Emily's death. But this wasn't something Richard could let go of. He had to confront him. With his heart pounding, Richard dialed the number. The phone rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" James's voice was older now, more tired than Richard remembered, but unmistakable. "James," Richard said, his voice tight. "It's Richard Lawson." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Richard could hear the hesitation in James's voice when he finally responded. "Richard, it's been a long time." "It has," Richard agreed, keeping his tone calm despite the tension building inside him. "I need to talk to you about Emily." Another pause. Richard could feel the weight of the silence between them. "Emily?" James's voice was cautious, almost guarded, as though he already knew what was coming. "What about her?" "I found a letter," Richard said, his voice steady but cold. Richard's voice turned sharper as he spoke. "I found a letter, James. A letter you wrote to her about something that happened between the two of you. I think you know what I'm talking about." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Richard could feel the weight of the unspoken truth hanging between them. When James finally spoke, his voice was low, almost resigned. "I didn't think you'd ever find out." Richard clenched his jaw, the confirmation hitting him hard. "So it's true then? You and Emily? What was it, James? An affair? A one-time thing?" James let out a heavy sigh. "It wasn't like that, Richard. It wasn't an affair. It was complicated." Richard's anger flared. "Complicated? That's all you have to say? I trusted you, James. You were my friend." "I know," James replied, his voice filled with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you, Richard. And I don't think Emily did either. What happened between us? It was a mistake. But it wasn't what you think." "Then tell me what it was," Richard demanded, his grip tightening on the phone. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like both of you kept a pretty big secret from me." James hesitated again. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost defeated. "It was a long time ago, Richard, before you and Emily were serious. We had a brief thing, but it ended. Emily chose you. She loved you. Whatever happened between us, it was over long before you two got married." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. "It was over," he repeated, his voice trembling. But that doesn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. Why didn't either of you tell me? I don't know, James admitted, his voice thick with remorse. At first, it didn't seem like it mattered. It was in the past, and we both moved on. But as time went on, I guess we were both afraid of what it would do to you, to your marriage. And then after Emily died, I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I didn't want to add to your pain. Richard shook his head, his anger simmering just below the surface. You think keeping it from me was better? You think I wouldn't have wanted to know the truth? James's voice was heavy with regret. I don't know, Richard. I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. But looking back, maybe I should have told you. Richard felt his chest tighten, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. He wanted to yell, to unleash the frustration that had been building inside him since he'd read the letter. But at the same time, he felt drained. The weight of all these secrets, all these lies, was suffocating. I don't know what to say to you, James, Richard said finally, his voice strained. I don't even know how to process this. I understand, James replied quietly. I'm sorry, Richard. I truly am. If I could go back and change things, I would. But all I can do now is apologize and hope you can find it in yourself to forgive me. Forgiveness. Richard wasn't sure if he was capable of that right now. The betrayal felt too fresh, too raw. But he also knew that holding on to his anger wouldn't bring him peace. I don't know if I can forgive you, James, Richard said honestly. But I appreciate you telling me the truth. There was a long pause before James spoke again. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. I know it's a lot to take in, but I'm willing to answer any questions you have. Richard wasn't sure if he wanted to hear more. He didn't know if he could dig any deeper into a past that had already caused him so much pain. But he knew one thing. He needed time. Time to process. Time to heal. I need some time, Richard said finally, his voice steady but tired. I don't know what comes next, but I need to figure that out. Take all the time you need, James replied softly. I'm sorry, Richard. Truly. The call ended, and Richard stood there for a long time, the phone still in his hand. His mind swirled with conflicting emotions. He had the truth now, or at least part of it. But it didn't bring the closure he had hoped for. If anything, it only left him feeling more lost. Later that evening, Richard sat alone in his apartment, staring out at the city lights. The weight of the conversation with James lingered heavily in his chest. He had spent so many years building his life on the belief that he understood his past, that he knew the people closest to him. But now, everything felt fractured. He thought about Emily, about her choices, her fears, and the secrets she had kept. He thought about James, about the betrayal and the regret in his voice. And most of all, he thought about Sophie, the one person who had brought all of this to light, the one person who still connected him to the future. Despite the pain, Richard knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this revelation destroy what he had just begun to rebuild. Sophie and Daniel were his family now, and he was determined to find a way to move forward, for their sake and for his own. Richard sat down with Sophie to share his conversation with James. She listened silently, her face calm, but with emotions flickering in her eyes. The weight of their shared reality lingered between them. I'm not sure what to think anymore, Richard admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I thought finding out the truth would bring some clarity, but now I just feel lost. Sophie nodded, her hand gently resting on Daniel's back as he dozed peacefully in her arms. I get it. I've been struggling with the same thing, but maybe the truth isn't always about finding closure. Maybe it's about understanding the past, so we can figure out how to move forward. Richard looked at her, a wave of gratitude washing over him. Despite everything, they were here together, facing an uncertain future. Maybe that was enough for now. I think you're right, Richard said quietly. I don't know what's next, but I want to figure it out, with you. Sophie smiled softly, her eyes warm with understanding. We'll figure it out. one step at a time. As Richard sat with Sophie and Daniel, a realization dawned on him. Despite the pain and unanswered questions, there was something worth holding on to. The truth had been messy and heartbreaking, but it had brought him closer to Sophie and Daniel. And for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The weeks following Richard's conversation with James were marked by reflection. The truth about Emily and James had forced him to confront parts of his past that had been buried. His emotions oscillated between anger and sorrow, but slowly, a sense of acceptance began to take root. It wasn't easy. Some mornings, he woke up feeling the weight of betrayal, the ache of realizing how much he hadn't known about Emily. But he also began to understand that the past couldn't be changed. What mattered now was how he chose to live with it, and what he did with the time he still had. Sophie remained a constant presence. Their relationship, though fragile, grew stronger each day. She had welcomed him into her life, into Daniel's life, and that had given Richard purpose again. One sunny afternoon, Richard joined Sophie and Daniel for a walk in the park. The golden light of the sun painted everything in warmth as they strolled along the path. Daniel sat in his stroller, babbling happily, while Sophie pushed him. Richard walked beside them, feeling a peacefulness he hadn't felt in years. When they reached a bench near the lake, Sophie gestured for Richard to sit. She unbuckled Daniel from the stroller and settled him on her lap, smiling as he squirmed with excitement at the sight of ducks gliding across the water. "Hard to believe how much he's grown already," Richard said, watching Daniel with a smile. "Yeah," Sophie replied, her voice tinged with affection. "It feels like just yesterday he was this tiny baby." She glanced at Richard, her expression thoughtful. "I'm really glad you're here. I know it hasn't been easy, but I'm glad we're figuring this out together." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. He had been waiting for this, some sign that they were moving in the right direction. "Me too," Richard said, his voice quiet but steady. He reached over and gently touched Daniel's tiny hand. "I'm so grateful for this, for both of you." As they sat by the lake, the sound of Daniel's happy babbling and the sight of the ducks swimming nearby, Richard felt something shift within him. He couldn't change the past, but here, in this moment, he could choose to be present, to build something new with Sophie and Daniel. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one worth taking. Together, they had the chance to create something meaningful, something that could heal the wounds of the past and offer hope for the future. "I'm glad too," Richard said softly, his voice tinged with sincerity. "I know I've made mistakes, and there's so much I wish I could go back and change. But I'm grateful for this, for you, and for Daniel." Sophie nodded, meeting his eyes with a warmth that hadn't been there when they first met. "I know it's been hard for both of us, but we're here now, and I think that's what matters." For a while, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the ducks glide across the lake's calm surface. Richard's mind wandered back to everything that had brought him to this moment: the grief, the secrets, the revelations. But, for the first time, those thoughts didn't weigh him down. Instead, he felt clarity, as if a fog had started to lift. "I've been thinking a lot," Richard said, breaking the silence, his gaze still fixed on the water. "About the past, about everything that's happened, and I realized something. Holding on to the anger, the hurt, it's not helping anyone. I may never fully understand why Emily made the choices she did, but I think I'm ready to let go of the need for answers." Sophie turned to him, her expression soft yet serious. "That's a big step, Richard. I know how hard this has been for you." He nodded slowly. "It has, but I don't want the past to define what happens next. I want to focus on what we have now, on being here for you and for Daniel." Sophie's lips curved into a gentle smile, her eyes shining with gratitude. "That means a lot to me, Richard. I know it hasn't been easy for any of us, but you're right. We can't change the past. We can only move forward." A wave of relief washed over Richard. The pain hadn't disappeared. It still lingered beneath the surface, but it no longer felt insurmountable. For the first time, he felt something stronger than grief. He felt purpose. Sophie shifted in her seat, her voice hesitant, but filled with hope. "You know, I've been thinking too, about Daniel. He's going to need people in his life who love him, who care about him, and I think you could be a big part of that, if you want to be." Richard's heart swelled at her words. He paused, letting their meaning sink in, before replying, his voice thick with emotion. "I want that more than anything. I want to be part of his life, of your life." Sophie smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm really glad to hear that, because I think he could use a grandfather." The word hit Richard harder than he expected. It carried weight, but in the best possible way. "Grandfather?" he repeated, almost in awe. It wasn't a role he had ever imagined for himself, especially after so many years of solitude and grief. But now, it felt like the most important role he could ever have. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how good I'll be at it, but I'm willing to try." Sophie laughed softly, resting her hand on Daniel's tiny foot. "That's all we can do, just try." They sat together, watching Daniel giggle at the ducks. For the first time in years, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Over the following months, Richard's life continued to transform in ways he hadn't thought possible. He and Sophie grew closer, navigating their complicated relationship with honesty and patience. While moments of tension and unanswered questions still lingered, they faced them together. Richard also became an active part of Daniel's life. He looked forward to their time together, whether it was trips to the park, reading bedtime stories, or simply marveling at the wonder in Daniel's wide eyes as he explored the world. It brought Richard a new kind of joy, one he hadn't realized he was capable of feeling. Through it all, Richard began to let go of the anger and bitterness that had consumed him for so long. He made peace with the fact that he might never have all the answers about Emily's past. Some things, he realized, were better left behind. What mattered now was the future, the life he was building with Sophie and Daniel, the family he was rediscovering. One evening, as Richard sat in his apartment looking out over the city skyline, he reflected on how much had changed. The loneliness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a deep sense of connection and belonging. He still visited Emily's grave from time to time, but those visits were different now. They weren't about mourning, they were about reflection. He still loved her and always would, but he knew he had to let her go to make room for the life he had now. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm, golden glow across the skyline, Richard felt a quiet contentment settle over him. His life wasn't what he had imagined years ago, but it was a life he cherished deeply. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that the future, however uncertain, could be filled with hope.